The University of Wolverhampton, how can we help you and work with you? Well, I think it's generally accepted nowadays that universities have a much broader role to play than just educating highly unqualified people between the ages of 18 and 21. Particularly given the current economic climate we find ourselves in, universities are a very useful local resource and capability to help companies become more competitive in a variety of ways. That can be through upskilling, it can be through helping develop new products, new processes, identify new markets in which you can engage with new customers, really. So we at the University of Wolverhampton are delighted that you've joined us this morning, and I appreciate we already work with a number of colleagues in the room, but if we haven't got a contact with you, please stay behind afterwards, and a number of colleagues are very pleased to talk to you as to how we can work with you and help you in the future, really. As I mentioned at the outset, we're delighted to organise a seminar this morning. I'm delighted Ian has come along as well. We've got a number of other colleagues who were quite active yesterday giving budget forecast predictions to local radio, local newspapers, and also we've got other colleagues who are active across other parts of the Black Country this morning involved in similar breakfast seminars such as this one as well. The building we're in is called the Wolverhampton Business Solutions Centre. It's a relatively new enterprise. It's a collaborative project between ourselves, the university, Wolverhampton City College, Business Link and Black Country Chamber of Commerce as well. And we put the project together earlier this year to give it a single focal point for businesses wishing to engage with those regional partners and hopefully leverage the benefits of those partners to the benefits of the company. So it's a single point of contact. Please come and talk to us about any problems. We'll try and put together solutions drawing upon that partnership, which is very broad and very wide-ranging, to the benefit of your own companies, and again help you ultimately to become more competitive. Last night I was looking at the various news feeds and news programmes and the papers, etc., trying to understand the scale of the budget that we've now heard about, really. And I suppose, as Ian will pick up later on this morning, it's quite a wide-ranging budget, but I think a number of newspapers described it as an axe and tax budget, quite frankly, which doesn't fill you with any great hope for the future, really. A number of other newspapers felt that in order to lift the spirits of the country, we need to rely on the English football team later on today. So I always think we're in sort of dire straits if that's where we're basing our hopes, really. And then late last night I saw Lord Digby Jones giving a presentation outside the House of Commons where he described the economy as being the doo-doo. So I think really it is a pretty dire state we're at the moment, and clearly one would hope the budget a way of getting us out of that. So I suppose perhaps in all seriousness though, what in some shape or form the budget needs to do is lead us out of the recession into recovery. That recovery will not be achieved through public sector-led initiatives now, given the massive funding cuts that are taking place in the public sector over the next 4 years. So very much the future success depends upon the private sector, which really is represented in this room today. So our hopes depend on you. Within the university sector, for example, about 40-45% of our income is public sector. And clearly the cuts over the next 4 years have a major impact on that. We've already gone through a major cost-cutting exercise over the last 12 months. The university has shed in excess of 150 jobs, and we've got a further £3 million worth of cost to take out of our activities to ensure that we are in a financially sound position going forward. But I think, though, the key to the regional success, and there's no magic bullet here, but the key to the regional success is us working together to help generate that growth, generate those new jobs, generate that the wealth in the economy, and hopefully it ultimately is a win-win-win scenario for everybody. So can I thank you again for coming this morning, and at this point can I hand over to Ian. Many thanks for preparing for the seminar this morning. Ian said he was up late last night pouring through the Chancellor's budget briefings. He has assumed that's water in his glass and not gin, because I appreciate Chancellors normally have a strong drink while they're delivering the budget, so we hope you remain sober.
Okay, yes. I did actually say I don't know what the Chancellor was drinking yesterday. I know, I think it was Gordon Brown always used to have Scottish whisky in his glass. I'm drinking nothing stronger than water, so I think if this time in the morning, if I was on anything stronger, I wouldn't be making very much sense. So thank you very much for that introduction, Ian. I too have some slides, so I'm just going to call those up. Sorry about that, little technical issues. We had a mobile mouse which doesn't seem to be working, so I'll let Louise sort that out. Obviously, the budget yesterday, the first for a new coalition government and the first budget delivered by a coalition since 1945. So I think this is going to be very interesting going forward, comparing how a coalition holds together in what are going to be very difficult times for the future. Financially difficult in terms of the fact they need to raise more money, and the country has been, as is well known, it's got financial difficulties, and the government's in need to raising funds and needing to cut expenditure. I always find with presentations that the technology is always what lets you down. This was working perfectly 20 minutes ago, and now so I do actually have handouts, so we were planning not to give these out, but I will work from crib sheets just to remind myself where we're going. Starting off then, UK PLC has our financial report for 09-10. We have government expenditure anticipated to be £671 million, as against income of only 515 billion. That should be so a deficit of 156 billion pounds. To give you some idea, that means that £1 out of every 4 that the government is planning to spend this year is going to be raised through borrowing rather than through taxes. And obviously, for the long run, that isn't sustainable, and the government needs to reduce that figure. Thank you, Louise, for sorting that out. Before I talk very much about the budget that's just presented, I want to give just a few general disclaimers which I need to about what I'm going to say. First of all, what I'm going to talk about today, none of it please regard as investment advice. I'm not regulated by the FSA, so I'm not giving investment advice. I'm purely an accountant commenting on the budget changes, the tax changes, and it's what you're hearing is my personal opinion. We make general comments only, no specific investment advice. Everybody's financial affairs are different. What might be right for the man in the pub, we all know the man in the pub who has his own opinions about what we should do. What might be ideal for him is possibly not ideal for you. Tax legislation changes constantly, so you need to keep referring to what are the latest changes rather than just relying on something. I hear the life of this video is intended to be 3 years. I would think certainly probably close to 9 months until the next budget is more likely. All that I'm going to talk about today is tax. Tax is what I do, but as far as all of us are concerned running our own businesses, we shouldn't let tax drive what are general commercial decisions. Always the commerciality should be what you're considering. Never let the tax tail wag the commercial dog is the advice I always give. And finally, all of what I'm talking about is based on the Budget Red Book that was published yesterday and what the Chancellor stood up and talked about. None of it is yet law. The Finance Bill does not become law until the Finance Act is passed, and it is in all probability that there will be changes between those two things. Historically, even when we haven't had a coalition, there have been changes between budget proposals and what finally gets enacted. When we've got a coalition situation, there's going to be a lot more pressure, possibly from the Liberal Democrats, not concerned about some of the cuts, possibly from the Tory side about some of the tax increases. So you need to bear in mind that these things might change before the Act is actually passed. So not necessarily just because I'm talking about it is it actually going to occur. As I say, the government has this financial problem, spending far more than what they're actually earning in income, and that needs to be addressed. In the famous, Charles Dickens said in the famous words of Mr. Micawber, that if your your expenditure exceeds your income, the result is misery. And so it is apparently going to be for all of us for the next few years. This deficit needs to be reduced, and in the coalition agreement, the Tories and the Lib Dems have agreed between them that that is going to be reduced 80% in terms of expenditure cuts and 20% in terms of tax rises. Personally, I'm very sceptical about that. Experience has shown in other countries that very rarely has anybody ever managed to achieve that ratio of expenditure cuts to tax rises. The example of Canada has been widely quoted in the press. I think they managed to achieve a 2/3, 1/3 ratio. The Chancellor yesterday has amended that to be 77% expenditure cuts, 23% tax rises. We have seen the tax rises, the 23% which he announced yesterday. The expenditure cuts aren't really going to be announced until the autumn statement, which we've now been told is going to be in October. I think that is when you will start to see the real tensions within the coalition about whether they can deliver on some of these tax cuts, which are going to be these expenditure cuts, which are going to be very, very painful. I have put there some comments about what the coalition said they're going to do. I'll come back to those in a little while. First of all, before I talk about the detail of what went on in the budget, I just want to give you a slightly broader picture and perhaps make one or two comments about where we find ourselves. These graphs and so on are all taken either from the new Office for Budgetary Responsibilities forecasts, or from the Budget Red Book, which was published yesterday, which is the Budget Red Book, which I talk about, is basically the document which they publish laying out in writing all the things that the Chancellor's announced in his speech. He made a specific comment that the Red Book this year is a lot thinner than it has been historically, probably only about a third of as much in there as there has been in previous years, and that's a deliberate decision by the government. But what it does mean is that there was very little detail in there. So a lot of what we're talking about and what's been announced, we won't know the detail until the actual legislation is published, which is sometime in the future. So of necessity, some of what I'm going to say, if you've got questions, might have to be quite general. One thing I didn't say at the beginning is I do welcome any questions as we go along. The format, I'm very relaxed. If you've got any questions, please just do wave your hands in the air and shout out, and I will try and answer them then, because I think it's far more relevant that I answer them when you've got the question. It's likely if there's something you don't understand, there's other people in the room that don't understand it either, and it would be good to address that rather than waiting until the end and probably we got even more confused. So this is a quick graph, as published by the Office of Budget Responsibility, showing expenditure and income over the last few years for the government. The red line is expenditure, the blue line is income. And if I can get the mouse to work, just want to highlight a couple of things. This area here obviously is where we are now. Expenditure up there, income down here, and the gap between those two lines is the deficit. Obviously, as you can see from that, it's never been higher in recent history. I think the last time it was higher, last time there was a coalition government in the last war, when obviously we were funding the cost of the war out of borrowing. But I think we should, all of us, if we're worried about what the future holds, take a little bit of reassurance from this graph, because what this graph does show is that in the past, historically, we have been quite able to reduce our expenditure by the sort of levels necessary without what at the time probably seemed very painful, but historically looking back at it, we did achieve that. And the interesting thing is that we achieved those expenditure cuts really not when the government said it was cutting expenditure, but far more when there was strong growth in the economy. And I think that is going to be the crucial thing going forward, as to whether the government achieves what it says it wants to achieve will depend upon the economy continuing to grow. Specifically, this area here where expenditure is rising is immediately after Margaret Thatcher came into power in 1979. That was the era of the cuts, when the Conservatives were trying to cut expenditure at that time. But actually they didn't achieve it. Because unemployment was rising, because the general level of benefits being paid out in that recession was increasing, it meant that government expenditure increased. And the actual reductions in government expenditure didn't occur until the second half of the 1980s, when the economy boomed under the Nigel Lawson. And again, in John Major's time, the recession of the early 90s was a peak in government expenditure, but it then fell away again strongly when the recovery happened. So my view is that the forecasts that were provided by the Office of Budgetary Responsibility depend quite strongly on the economy returning to growth and us not having what's been talked about widely, a double dip recession. And the question is, can that be achieved while at the same time the government is saying it's wanting to cut a lot of the expenditure? And as you can see from this, the actual increases in tax that the OBR is suggesting thinks we're going to have to make is quite small, really. The level of tax as a percentage of national income is not really going to rise more than a couple of percentage points, and on a historical basis remains fairly low. The other point I need to just draw to your attention and make you understand, hopefully, is the government red book that I refer to is actually a document which is published by the government. It's a political document, and if you do see some of the comments that are made drawn from there, and I'm using some of the graphs from the government red book today, is that these are political documents, and so we need to take them, I think, with a little pinch of salt. Just understand that perhaps there's a fair bit of spin involved in what we're being told. The reason why I presented that graph to you first is because that was actually produced by the Independent Office for Budgetary Responsibility, and gives you enough history to see that actually our expenditure levels at the moment, by historic standards, aren't unique. We've been there before. All right, the deficit might be slightly higher than it has been previously, but that's more because tax income is low rather than expenditure being particularly high. If we look at the next graph, this is what the government published in the Red Book, and you'll see that this only goes back to the start of the last Labour government in 1997, so you don't see any of the history about when we've previously been in this situation before. So the story that was being told by the Chancellor yesterday was, oh, the last government have got us in this mess, expenditure's been allowed to run out of control, and that's why I've got to take the steps that I've got to take. Well, true to an extent, but it's not true that we've never been here in terms of levels of government expenditure before. Again, this graph shows two forecasts. The dotted forecasts are the original Office for Budgetary Responsibility forecasts, and the government have changed those slightly and now said they're going to be reducing expenditure faster than they'd previously planned to, and increasing tax slightly more than what was previously planned. But in all events, reducing that deficit down, the gap between the two lines, the deficit is being reduced down so that by the end of this Parliament we're getting close to having a balanced budget again. But as I say, not really giving you a lot of history there, just the recent past. Perhaps I could argue, if I was cynical, which I am, as you'll probably realise as I continue to give this presentation, that there's a bit of political spin there. The result of those changes should be that our public sector borrowing is going to reduce, and that graph is what they call a fan chart. The government statisticians like these fan charts. Some of us sort of think, have we perhaps had a little bit too much of the to drink last night? We can't quite see where that's going. What it actually means is those different areas of shadings of grey are different proportions of potential outcomes. The two extremes, the light grey areas, show what they think is an 80% probability that they will get somewhere between those two extremes. The black line in the centre, if you can make it out, is where they think what their actual projection is, but they accept that in all probability they're going to miss that slightly. But each of the shadings of grey gives an increasing 20% probability that they will achieve that. So you can see that potentially, depending on the level of future growth, and I think, as I said previously, that's crucial, we're either going to end up in a budget surplus of 4%, and that's the best possible outcome at the bottom, or the worst possible outcome is that the deficit will only be reduced down to 6% of national income. So a fairly wide band there of probabilities by the end of this Parliament. And the flip side of that last graph is their projections as to future income. And interesting, you'll see that that growth chart does show within the 20% possibility at the bottom that actually we won't achieve growth going forward, and so a potential for a double-dip recession. They're saying that their trend forecast is that growth is going to rebound to nearly 3% at one point, but averaging out at about 2.5% going forward. But within that range, I think 6% is probably being a little bit optimistic at the top range. So that's the background, the macroeconomic position that the government's in. Now I want to turn and look at what are their specific intentions and how they're going to achieve what they need to achieve over the coming period. I think all of the things that were announced in the budget had been fairly well leaked in advance. And actually, if you look back to what happened in the election campaign and what is laid out in the coalition agreement, there's actually very limited areas that the Chancellor had to make real differences and to do to raise a lot of this extra tax. And that is because a lot of areas really were ruled out either by their election promises or by the coalition agreement. So national insurance, the Conservatives were targeting the last Labour government for their tax on jobs, which was the increase in employers' national insurance. So having criticised the last government for that, they're hardly going to be want to be seen to be increasing national insurance contributions. Personal tax allowances. The Lib Dems have targeted that to be increased to £10,000 each. So there's a limited scope for increasing rates of income tax. The last government increased the highest rate to 50% again. Couldn't really seem to be increasing it any more than that, having criticised the last government. So really very little scope for increasing the take from income tax. Corporation tax. It was stated by the Conservatives in the election campaign they wanted to try and reduce corporation tax rates to make the UK more competitive compared with our international competition. So not really much scope for increases there. So really we knew that the increases were going to have to come in other areas. The only other thing that they specifically said that they wanted to target was capital gains tax. The Liberal Democrats in particular wanted to target what they saw as tax avoidance, people turning income tax at certain rates as high as 40 or 50% into capital gains tax at potentially only 10 or 18%, and they wanted to do something to target and stop that happening. So just perhaps with all those things in our minds, a quick little look here at where the government raises most of its money and what those pledges mean in terms of what was left that could be raised. And really, as you'll see, the biggest sources of income for the government in terms of tax are income tax, national insurance and VAT, by far and away the three largest areas. And as I previously said, income tax and national insurance pretty much ruled out as major areas where they can raise more money. So we all knew in advance of the budget that it was going to be VAT that bore the brunt of the increases. Other areas, obviously, always alcohol, tobacco, fuel duty, always areas. Increases had been announced in the March budget, so there wasn't really much scope for any further increases. All of those areas are ones where the strong lobbies, the road transport lobby and the AA and the RIC don't like increases in fuel duty, and the industry and sort of the alcohol, beer and cider manufacturers had all complained about the increase in the last budget, and as a result, the Chancellor's actually decreased the duty on cider in this budget. So no real scope there. And compared to the big areas, those are pretty small possibilities for raising further tax there. The interesting one, I think, personally, is that capital gains tax that had been referred to as one area where they were worried that there was a lot of avoidance going on, only last year raised just over £2.5 billion. So without massive increases in the rate of tax, you are not going to raise significant amounts of money, even by targeting that level of anti-avoidance. So whilst it was subject to a lot of heat and debate in the election campaign and prior to the budget, not really an area where the government's going to get a lot of money from. So turning to the business tax proposals, the business lobby is one area where they are highly vocal in terms of their opposition, obviously, to further them being the target for further tax increases. Industry has a lot of money to spend on lobbyists, has a lot of money and obviously makes large donations to political parties. So their voice is always heard when the budget is being prepared. And so I think you do get a lot of hissing, as quoted there, from business if they try and raise too much tax. Corporation tax. This was an area where we knew they were going to try and make some reductions. Specifically, it had been stated that they were worried about large corporations leaving the UK, going offshore in order to reduce their tax bills, and that the UK had become, over the last few years, uncompetitive in terms of international rates of corporation tax. Specifically, I think there was a couple of companies over the last couple of years. Last year, Aviva, previously Norwich Union, had announced they were moving their international headquarters to Ireland. Literally last week, Zurich Insurance announced they were moving to Dublin as well. And so the government is aware that they are standing to lose a lot of money that's contributed to the exchequer by multinational businesses that headquarter themselves in London. If they move their tax domicile offshore, we lose all of that income that they're contributing in respect of their international operations. So if there was a need to, as far as the government was concerned, to reduce the main large company rate of corporation tax, and that is what it was announced yesterday, that the rate will fall from 2011-12 onwards. One point that's interesting, to me anyway, is that what you will see in all of these budget announcements is there's very little that relates to the current year that we're in now. All of it relates to 2011-12 and later years. And there's a good reason for that. Now we are so dependent upon IT in terms of the delivery of tax to the government. All as accountants, all that we do in terms of preparing tax returns for clients is all done electronically. It's all submitted to the government electronically. All those systems take time to be designed and tested for all the changes that happen every year in the tax system. The good old days of Nigel Lawson introducing tax giveaways in 1983 and 1987. He was able to stand up in March and announce a tax giveaway that was going to take place in the following 2 months later in May. It was in all our pay slips in that May, and the election took place in June. You know, a pre-election bribing us with our own money. It doesn't work anymore because logistically they cannot do it in terms of the IT requirements. So any giveaway has to be planned at least 18 months in advance, which probably gives us more time to actually consider, you know, that it is our own money they're bribing us with. So all of the increases and changes generally happening in 2011-12 and later years. So as you can see there, the decreases in the main rate of corporation tax going over a number of 4 years through to 2014-15. Interestingly as well, they've also reduced the rate for small companies because they're saying they want to encourage entrepreneurship and new company formation. The last government had proposed an increase from 21 to 22% in 2011-12. That's now been reversed, and actually the rate's been decreased to 20%. But after that, no further decreases. Small companies are probably an easier target for the government because they're less likely to migrate offshore. Having said that, they raise far less money from small business than they do from large business. So the existence of the small companies rate is still there to encourage small businesses. One or two other points, perhaps, that the government's made the point in the Red Book that if with these changes in corporation tax, the UK will then have the lowest rate of corporation tax in the G7, the seven largest economies, and the fifth lowest in the G20, the group of 20 largest economies in the world. A couple of other points that were raised on business tax. Control foreign company rules are really only impact on multinational companies, but it's targeted anti-avoidance, where companies are moving some of their operations offshore to lower tax jurisdictions. The control foreign companies rules are being examined to see if the government can take a larger proportion of that. The other thing that was announced, widely trailed, was this levy on the banks. Not a lot of detail in the Red Book other than to say that it's going to be targeted at trying to reduce the sort of risky behaviour that the banks indulged in before the financial crisis, and that resulted in RBS having to be taken into government ownership. A lot of that growth in the bank's balance sheets historically was based on borrowing rather than on their own money, their own capital. So the government is targeting to basically tax them based on the amount of money that they borrow, the amount of risk that the banks take. The more risk they take, the more that this levy will raise. And again, it's very interesting that it was announced as part of an international sort of cooperation. France and Germany made similar announcements yesterday. I haven't seen the details of what they're proposing, but presumably something similar to what we're doing, because all of the governments are aware that if they act alone, then all that will happen is banks will simply move their operations offshore to other countries where they're not going to be subject to this levy. I think some of the feedback that I've seen in the press and on the internet last night was that actually this isn't as bad as the banks had thought. They thought they might be targeted more for 5 billion. So actually, whilst it's bad news for them, not as bad as perhaps as they'd thought. So that was the good news, these cutting rates of corporation tax. The bad news, which again had been fairly widely predicted, is he's going to target capital allowances. That is, the rates of allowances that are paid on business investment. This was an area of quite strong debate. I don't know if you saw the debate between the party leaders in Birmingham during the election campaign, and Gordon Brown was criticising the Conservatives because of this, because he said this was going to impact badly on manufacturing, and there's no doubt that it will. Capital-intensive manufacturing, where you have to invest a lot of money in plant and machinery, is going to be hit by these changes. I've highlighted there a couple of the last 2 years, current years in blue. Going forward is just in the brown for the changes. The last government had announced an increase in what's known as the annual investment allowance. The annual investment allowance was introduced by Alistair Darling and came in initially at £50,000, which meant that any business, the first £50,000 they invested each year in plant and machinery would immediately be written off against tax. And for most small businesses, that was a big improvement on what had been there before. when they were writing down allowances equivalent to 25% in each year. There had been first-year allowances previously as high as 100%, down to 50%, 40%, but this annual investment allowance was generally beneficial to small businesses, but not to large companies. That had been increased by Alistair Darling to £100,000. In the budget yesterday, the Chancellor announced that he's now going to reduce that down to £25,000, but only from April 2012. So a big opportunity there for companies. If you are going to invest in plant and machinery, do it before 2012, because your annual investment allowance is still £100,000. And general planning points is that all businesses should look to equalise their expenditure on capital, plant and machinery. Don't do it in big lumps. Try and do it evenly, year by year, to make sure that you make the best use of the capital allowances that are available. Writing down allowances have been reduced also. The general rate of writing down allowance on plant and machinery reduced from 20% down to 18%, and on the long life assets and special rate for sort of planes and ships and plant and machinery within buildings has also been reduced down from 10% down to 8%. Obviously, there's going to be a cash flow impact on businesses. The Chancellor says that these rates are in line with what industry generally depreciates its assets at. So he argues that it's more in line with general commerciality, and that's his justification. He also says in the Red Book that manufacturing as a whole will pay less corporation tax under this new regime because he's reduced the rates. I think there's a bit of an assumption there. I think large companies, because their rates have been reduced more, will possibly pay less, but some small, medium-sized businesses only paying the lower rate of corporation tax will be badly hit. Small companies, again, he made the point that 95% of businesses still will have 100% of their expenditure relieved immediately. That means 95% of businesses spend less than $25,000 a year on capital expenditure, so they will still continue to get 100% relief immediately. But a planning point, if you're going to, might be worthwhile bringing expenditure forward if you've got plans to spend significant amounts before that time. One of the interesting points that I didn't mention on the last slide is that the rates of capital, the rates of corporation tax, small companies pay, or companies pay a lower rate on the first £300,000 of their profits. There's then a marginal rate up to £1.5 million, and above £1.5 million it's then a flat rate, which, as we've seen, is coming down. Those bands have not been increased since before 1997, which really is quite surprising. Over the same period, your personal allowance for income tax has increased from £4,000 to, following the budgets, nearly £7,500, an 87% increase. No increase in the bands for corporation tax. So more and more companies are going to find over that time they've been dragged into the marginal and higher rates of corporation tax. And that concept is called by economists fiscal drag, and it's a very powerful tool in the hands of the Chancellor. If he chooses not to increase personal allowances, not to increase those sort of limits, then general inflation, the general decrease in the value of money, increase in prices, increase in wages, will tend to drag more and more businesses and more people into the higher rates of tax. And that's specifically also going to be the case with income tax, that we're seeing that there has not been an increase in the threshold at which people start to pay higher rates of tax now for a few years, and more people are going to be dragged into the higher rates of income tax. And it's a very useful tool for the Chancellor over the next few years as he's looking to raise more money, but to do it without a headline-grabbing increase in the tax rate, to simply say nothing, make no announcement, don't announce an increase in the allowances and in the bands, and all of us will end up slowly, as hopefully our wages and as prices and turnovers and profits increase, all of us will slowly find ourselves paying more and more tax and at higher rates potentially. Value-added tax, as I say, the one area that was widely predicted, the one big area of tax income where he was free to increase the rates. And sure enough, as widely predicted, increased from 17.5% to 20%. Interestingly, not until the 4th of January 2011. The last government was criticised quite heavily when they made changes in VAT, that they did so at very short notice and on inconvenient dates like 1st of January, New Year's Day, and that wasn't good for business. A big compliance burden on businesses having to suddenly change all their IT systems, particularly impacting on small business. So I saw last night that the Federation of Small Businesses, while not welcoming the increase, at least welcomed the fact that he deferred it until the 4th of January, and the reason why that date was chosen, I think, is to give businesses time after the Christmas holidays to make the changes. So I think there has been some listening on the government side from some of these representations made by business organisations. The point that the Chancellor made quite strongly is that he hasn't increased the rate of tax payable on those zero-rated items, and that the lower rate on heating fuel also remains at 5%. And I think that was part of a concerted effort by the Chancellor to show that he's trying to minimise the impact on some of the low-paid people and people on lower incomes. And there are other areas where he also tried to show that he was trying to restrict the pain for those on the lower income and concentrate that more of these increases are going to happen for people on higher incomes. The VAT flat rate scheme, which is available to businesses with turnovers up to £150,000, there will be changes in those rates. I don't know whether anybody in the room uses the flat rate scheme. It's something that I find useful with smaller clients. It can reduce compliance quite considerably and potentially be beneficial, mean that businesses pay less tax. The flat rate scheme rates are linked to the main rate, and so they will also increase in line with the main rate. As with all these things, where there is scope for anti-avoidance or avoidance by business, there is going to be legislation introduced to stop people artificially perhaps bringing forward transactions so that they only suffer VAT at the lower rate. They're quite limited in scope. It only tends to be targeted towards VAT exempt businesses where they can't claim back the input tax, so like banks and insurance companies. General commercial businesses where they're registered for VAT, you'll be able to recover the VAT out anyway, so it tends not to be such an issue. But there will be legislation to prevent you artificially moving dates around to use the lower rate before the higher rate comes in, the 20% rate comes in. Another interesting point, fiscal drag again, no increase in the thresholds. The registration limit still remains at £70,000. So small businesses beneath that level don't have to register. With turnover up to £70,000 don't have to register. The deregistration limits also remained at £68,000. So once you register, you can't deregister until your turnover falls below that level. And it's interesting to note that part of the justification given for the increase in VAT rates is that generally European Union VAT is an EU tax. Generally rates in the EU are higher than in the UK. And at 20% ours still remains below the European average. The thing that isn't typical for the UK is that our £70,000 threshold is actually very high compared with European averages, and that can lead to distortions. I've said the final point there is that certain businesses, not generally business-to-business situations, but business-to-consumer, where hairdressers and people like that are delivering straight to the public, if their turnover goes over £70,000, now, with the 20% higher rate, that has a cost to them of about £11,667 if they go over that threshold and suddenly have to start paying 20% of all of their income over to the Exchequer in VAT. And so there will be continued incentives for business-to-consumer businesses like hairdressers. I was talking to somebody here who says he uses carpet fitters, same sort of idea, where you're installing, fitting carpets in people's homes. It's very often the case that they're self-employed and provide the service direct to their customer, because it means that they don't have to register for VAT if they keep their turnover beneath threshold. So tax planning points from the VAT rate change, not a great deal. If you're a registered commercial business, then you're not going to really be impacted on it, and it's really going to be the ultimate end user consumer who is going to suffer those increases. A few other business proposals. The widely criticised increase in the national insurance contributions, well, the government's Conservatives elected criticised it strongly during the election campaign, but decided it needs to go ahead anyway because they can't afford not to do it. That is how bad things are. They need the money so desperately. However, they have said we've mitigated it by raising the thresholds by £21 per week above inflation. We haven't got an exact figure because we won't know the inflation rate that's used until September this year. But whatever the inflationary increase is, it's going to be £21 more. So hopefully taking a lot of employees out of the employer's national insurance system altogether. I think he quoted a figure of about 650,000 people. And so hopefully that will mitigate the impact for companies and employers, such as all of us, having to pay. employers' NIC. Another point that was raised about employers' national insurance contributions was this idea that new businesses outside of the South East, so in the areas of the country where they want to encourage more entrepreneurship, the formation of more new businesses, are going to be given a reduction in their employers' national insurance bill of up to £5,000 for each of the first 10 employees they take on. And that apparently is going to be all new businesses. Now, it's not anticipated that these legislation is going to be passed until September, and it's going to take until then to get EU approval for this. But what they've said is that this will be backdated, and all new businesses as formed as from today will qualify. I think there's potential for a lot of anti-avoidance activity there. A lot of us might think, well, I'd like to go and set up a new company to make use of this and transfer some of my current employees into this new business and then save £5,000 of employers' national insurance on each one of them, £50,000 potentially. I am sure there will be anti-avoidance. The Red Book doesn't really talk about it. We've got to wait until the legislation is published to see what that is. But I think anybody who's trying to encourage entrepreneurship in the Midlands should be aware that that is available, and we need to see what the final legislation is before we can really see if there's any way that we can use it to benefit clients. A couple of other points designed to encourage small businesses. The Enterprise Finance Guarantee, this is a scheme whereby the government backs and guarantees borrowings from the banks by small businesses. That's been expanded, additional £20,000 worth of government expenditure going in there, which will potentially give us £700,000 worth of additional lending for small businesses. But he's also recognised that a lot of businesses are finding it hard to raise funds from the banks and hard to raise capital as opposed to borrowing, and so there's also this growth capital fund which is going to be raising additional share capital for SME businesses going forward. And finally, on the business proposals, something that was a bit of a surprise, the Labour government had announced they were going to abolish the special rules that relate to furnished holiday lettings. The main reason I think why they were planning to do that was because the EU had decided that our regime, which was beneficial for UK held properties, was anti-competitive, and we had to expand it out to all properties within the EU, and the government didn't particularly want to do that, but there seems to have been a bit of a U-turn now that they are going to try and keep some kind of a beneficial regime for people owning furnished holiday lettings, albeit that there are going to be some changes potentially to tighten up the rules a little bit. If people were planning to make any changes because of the proposed changes in the rules, I'd say hang fire now. Don't go selling your holiday home in Wales that you've been letting out just because you think the rules are going to change, because it looks like they're not now. So that pretty much covers most of the highlights in terms of business tax. In terms of personal tax proposals, as a failed physicist, I did physics at university, and to be honest, it was a bit beyond me, so I had to go into accountancy. It's always filled me with a little bit of satisfaction that apparently Albert Einstein found income tax impossible to sort out. So, what have been the proposed changes? Well, I suppose the mainline one, the headline-grabbing one, is this reduction in income tax. Perhaps not what we were expecting, but something that was a proposal from the Liberal Democrats, and that they put into the coalition agreement, that they want to try and raise the personal allowance for income tax up to £10,000 to take more of the very low-paid people out of the tax net altogether. Obviously, that's going to be expensive to do, and potentially it's going to be highly beneficial to higher-paid people because potentially they could save at their top rate of tax, and so certainly one of the things that we see is that they're going to make other changes to ensure that that doesn't happen, and that all the benefit goes solely to the very low paid who are going to be taken out of the tax threshold, and also people paying just the basic rate of tax. So as a start towards that £10,000 target, they have increased it by £1,000 from the 6th of April 2012. Again, can't be introduced straight away because of all the IT chaos that would cause, so it is deferred until not only till 2011 but actually to 2012. But that personal allowances will be increased to £7,475, or it will also be inflationary increased as well, I imagine. To compensate for that, if you are a higher rate taxpayer paying at 40 or 50%, the basic rate limit, which is the top point at which you start to pay the higher rates, is going to be reduced by approximately £2,500, so that to ensure that you will pay have more income tax at those higher rates, so the overall benefit for you will disappear. You will pay less at the basic. You'll get a larger personal allowance, but you'll also pay more at the higher rate. Again, the exact figures for those increases won't be known until the September Consumer Prices Index is known, and that's the point at which they set what all those increases are going to be for future years. He did also announce that that basic rate limit, the point at which you go from paying basic rate to higher rate, is going to be frozen in 2013-14. Again, fiscal drag being used to drag more people into the higher rate of tax and increase the tax take. Relatively painless and politically not so controversial as raising tax rates. The 50% additional rate, which was introduced and announced by Alistair Darling to start from the 6th of April this year, the government said, well, as much as we don't like it, we don't see any alternative, it's going to have to stay in place. So those people earning above 150,000 are going to be paying at a new higher rate. A couple of other things that were also announced. Pension contributions. The last government had announced there were going to be changes and restrictions on pension contributions and the liability of relief for those people earning at those highest rates. The government have said that they think that these proposals are potentially distorting and not good for business, and so they're going to not introduce what had previously been planned, but they haven't announced what they're going to do. They're going to go out to consultation, they're going to consult with the industry, but it looks as though they will introduce some kind of a restriction on the amount of pension contributions you can make each year, possibly 30 or 40,000 pounds to limit the benefit to higher rate taxpayers. ISA subscription levels, one tax planning point to people I would make with clients is if you can afford to put money away, do it in an ISA, because then any income that arises on that money, those savings won't be liable to tax. Those limits traditionally haven't been increased in line with inflation, but the Chancellor said he's going to start doing that from 2011-12. Another thing that was widely announced in the election campaign was that the new government wanted to reduce the amount of tax credits available to higher rate paid people. Tax credits previously had been available to people earning up to £50,000 individually and potentially up to £80,000 as a household. You were still entitled to child tax credits. Well, the government says it doesn't want to continue paying tax credits to those sort of higher paid people. It wants to target all the help on the lowest paid families. So one of the things that was announced was that child tax credits are going to be reduced for people earning above £40,000 as from April 2011, and there'll be further reductions in the future. And I've repeated myself there on the ISA subscription limit, sorry I hadn't spotted that previously. So the flip side of those child tax credit changes is that as far as child benefit is concerned, they're going to freeze child benefit, that's one of the things that's announced, but that all the child tax credits money that's been saved on those higher rate paid people will be targeted on the lowest paid sections of the thresholds of people who can get child tax credits, and I think that is part of a deliberate effort by the Chancellor to show that they are targeting more of these increases and more of the pain on higher paid people rather than the people at the bottom end of the income scale. Another thing that was perhaps slightly unexpected was this state pension triple guarantee from April 2011. The state pension is going to increase in line with either earnings or prices, or at 2.5%, whichever of those is the highest. So no more 70p increases was what the Chancellor said. Again, very politically, a bit of spin there on criticising what the Labour government had done previously. Again, the state pension age are proposed to be increased to 66, and then beyond that to 67 as well in the future. They're now saying they're going to consult and introduce that sooner. So again, another way of trying to reduce expenditure by making us all work longer before we get our state pension. Levels of housing benefit, another area that had been politically controversial before the election. Those payments are going to be restricted from April 2011. Up until now, generally, when benefits and tax credits have been uprated, they've been uprated in line with the Retail Prices Index. It's been announced across the board that going forward, all such things will be increased only in line with the Consumer Prices Index, which generally is lower than the Retail Prices Index. And the argument used there is, well, it's obviously a money-saving change, but also because it's felt that the CPI better reflects the true price increases for people who are in receipt of benefits and pensions. The main difference between the two is that RPI includes housing costs, and the government's stated logic is that housing costs are covered by housing benefits, and we will uprate that in line with housing costs. Other benefits should only be therefore uprated in line with the Consumer Prices Index. Another thing that had been announced before the budget, child trust funds are going to be slowly phased out. This was a scheme the Labour government introduced to give money to the parents of, for children, newborn children, to go into a trust fund to be available to them at their 18th birthday. The government's decided that that is really a luxury that we can't anymore afford, and the child tax benefit also has been frozen. So the big area of personal tax where change was expected, widely predicted, and was these changes to capital gains tax. The stated reason was that when capital gains tax rates are considerably lower than income tax rates, there is a big incentive for people to convert income into capital gains, and that was a type of avoidance that the government wanted to try and restrict and stop people doing this. I'm a little bit sceptical about whether this is really being done to raise money or is really a political point, because it's something the Liberal Democrats wanted to do and that they got put into the coalition agreement. And so I'm a little bit sceptical about whether this will actually achieve what is being the stated reason for doing it. And as you've seen in my little graph showing the amount of money raised, capital gains tax raises only a very small amount of money compared with the other areas of government income, so it's not an area that's going to suddenly get us out of the hole in terms of the government's finances. Nevertheless, the main headline announcement is that the rate of capital gains tax for those who are above the higher rate threshold, who are paying tax at either 40 or 50% income tax, they will pay 28% capital gains tax as opposed to 18% now on non-business assets, on disposals that don't qualify for this entrepreneurs relief. And I tend to think that, certainly as far as most of my clients are concerned, and people who might be looking or tempted to transfer income into capital, a lot of them very often will be covered by the entrepreneur's exemption anyway, and so really these changes do nothing to address that particular area. Just to give you an idea of the type of things that people might look to do is, if they run their own business and are perhaps coming up to retirement or thinking of selling the business, rather than extracting their profits every year by way of salary and bonus and dividends, which would be liable to higher rates of income tax, they would instead leave those funds in the company, and therefore when they sell the business it's worth more, they will get more sale proceeds, and so that will be taxed at a much lower rate. Well, if you run your own business, the intention is actually that now more of that money will qualify for the 10% band, is increase the gains eligible for the entrepreneurs relief from 2 million of lifetime gains up to 5 million of lifetime gains. Unexpected, and to me exactly contrary to what the stated reason is. So I'm a little bit, I think here that almost George Osborne has been quite clever in that he's supposedly done what the Liberal Democrats have asked, but I think it was subject to attack by some Tory MPs that this was going to go against, it was going to damage entrepreneurship and going to adversely affect people who are coming up to retirement, and I think actually it won't, because of the way that the changes have been made. Another area that was potentially highlighted was that they were going to reduce the annual exemption for capital gains tax down from £10,000 down to a figure I saw quoted about £1,000. Because obviously that is, again, very beneficial for people who are selling perhaps shares or second homes. The first £10,000 of gains in your hand every year is exempt. From a purely tax administrative point of view, I always thought it was a non-starter to reduce that significantly. There is no way that the Inland Revenue wants loads more people dragged into the capital gains tax net, because the administration of the tax is hugely expensive for them and disruptive. Because all of those people, you make a one-off disposal of a capital asset that takes you above £1,000, all of a sudden you've got to complete an income tax return, which you might not have had to have done before. So, from a tax compliance point of view, I never thought that was going to happen, and sure enough, he's actually frozen the limits this year and announced they're going to be increased in line with inflation going forward. Other changes, the entrepreneurs' relief eligibility criteria haven't been changed. Now, this is quite a surprise, because I think entrepreneurs' relief was introduced following a big fuss that there was when the government last changed capital gains tax, and capital gains tax has been changed repeatedly over the life of the last Labour government, generally making it Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor, reduced the rates of capital gains tax. Under the old Tory government, it used to be taxed as your highest slice of income, so potentially at up to 40%. And Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor, introduced taper reliefs that meant that on sales of business assets, the rate came down to as low as 10%. When those rules were changed back again, potentially to increase the rate to 18%, there was a lot of fuss, and it was originally announced in the autumn statement in 2007, and in his March 2008 budget, there was a lot of pressure from business, and so Alistair Darling announced that there was going to be this entrepreneurs relief created. But what it wasn't actually a new relief. It was simply reintroducing what had previously existed, a relief called retirement relief. And it was quite a surprise that actually they've never got round to actually writing any new rules for entrepreneurs relief. We are still left with the old retirement relief rules. And there were a few things about those rules which are actually quite regressive and considered to be unfair. One of the classic ones which I saw quoted is that if you have a business that's owned by its shareholders, and perhaps with the directors owning sort of fairly large amounts of shares, 20-30% each, whereas a lot of the employees also own shares, perhaps only a few shares, 1 or 2% of the company, then one of the requirements to qualify for entrepreneurs relief is you must own at least 5% of the business that you are selling. So that potentially in that situation you would have directors selling their substantial shareholdings, getting many millions of pounds for them and paying only 10%, but general employees of the company who happen to own shares in the business would be selling their few shares and paying potentially now 28% because their shares don't qualify for entrepreneurs relief. Seems very unfair. They haven't done anything about it, and I've got to say personally I'm very surprised about that. So does it achieve the stated aims, which were to reduce income tax avoidance and increasing fairness? I've got to say I'm sceptical. I don't think they do, but you know that may well be amended going forward. But overall, it was anticipated that capital gains tax was going to increase, and it has done. So this is a quick graph, again taken from the Budget Red Book, so this is the government's spin on it, is how all these changes in personal tax are going to impact on individuals. And this graph shows each of the 10 what they call deciles, so 10% of the population, different levels of income, from the bottom decile, which is everybody earning up to £14,200, all the way up to the top decile, which is everybody earning over £49,700. And this is the impact on each of us in terms of the tax. The green shows the indirect VAT tax effect, and all of us are going to be worse off for the green because VAT has obviously been put up, which impacts all of us. Direct tax is the black. Those on lower and basic rate tax are obviously gained from the increase in the personal allowance, so all those black bars are showing a net gain, whereas the higher paid people who are paying at the higher rates aren't going to benefit from the increase in the personal allowance, and indeed are going to suffer from some of the changes that have been announced in pension contributions and so on. So that will impact on us negatively for direct tax. And then the light green shows changes in benefits and tax credits, which is the middle income people are having some of their tax credits taken away because they're being focused on the lowest paid. So the black line shows the net impact in terms of pounds per year on average for people in each of those different bands. And you can see, so people in the bottom level earning less than 14,200, it's anticipated the net effect is going to be they're going to lose out to the tune of about £170, whereas those in the top decile earning over 49,000 are potentially going to be nearly £1,600 a year worse off. This is the government spin. This is what they're saying. They are targeting most of the pain on those who can afford to pay it. You know, if it's expressed as a percentage of your income, it's probably not quite as such a dramatic effect, but nevertheless that is the way they want us to see the changes they've introduced. One point I did want to make from a business point of view, because it's an area that I work with a lot with clients and I'm conscious that there have been changes, albeit they won't be announced in the budget, is around tax compliance. I'm just keeping an eye on the time, I think we're okay. The tax compliance, in the way the Inland Revenue treats us as individuals and businesses when they start looking into our affairs, and this is an area which you won't see announced in the budget, but it's an area where the government have targeted the Inland Revenue to raise considerably more money. The Inland Revenue now, quite interestingly, sorry, I should call them HM Revenue and Customs as they now are, the merged organisation, actually published now a business plan. I don't suppose many of us get around to reading it, but if you did, you would see that the Revenue reckon they're going to raise an additional 33% from their tax inspection and investigations activities. A massive increase in potential tax take from business, no announcement in the budget whatsoever. Well, there was very slightly in the small print saying they were going to target to make some changes to the way this is impacted. And actually, all of these things I put on here were announced pre-budget, and they've actually announced that as from 2011-12, there are going to be further increases in penalty regimes. They haven't laid out the details, they've just said there's going to be a further increase in the penalty regimes. So, for 2010-11, if they achieve that 33% increase, that means going to mean that business and individual tax investigations are going to raise an additional £4 billion. Now, a lot of that will come from large business investigations. That's where they get most of their money from. But nevertheless, £1.5 billion from small business and personal tax, which probably impacts most of us in the room. The main way on which I think they're going to target raising more money is the new penalty regime. When they were separate organisations, the Inland Revenue and Customs and Excise had totally different penalty regimes for different taxes. When they merged themselves together, one of their projects was to try and create a unified penalty regime to affect across all different taxes and all different, so corporation tax, income tax, VAT and everything. And those new penalty regimes basically came into effect from April 2010. And the main impact of that is that whereas previously with income tax and corporation tax there was the possibility, if you got an inquiry by the revenue, they challenged your figures, looked into it and found things that needed to be changed, so long as you cooperated with them, made full disclosure and that the amounts that concerned weren't too large, potentially you had 100% mitigation of any penalties. The maximum penalty was 100% of the tax involved, but you could mitigate that down potentially to nil. Under the new regime, it is quite clear that unless you go with a voluntary disclosure to the revenue, then the minimum penalty you are going to face is 20%. If they challenge you and find something, then you're going to be facing a minimum penalty of 20%. The only way you'll get it below that level is if you voluntarily go to them and make the disclosure before they come to you. Now that is going to raise a lot of money from businesses where previously would perhaps not have suffered. From what we've seen of the implementation of this since April, they aren't being terribly aggressive. I've seen settlements in the 20 to 30% level, but nevertheless the maximum is still there for 100. And whilst we may not see many more people being charged 100% of their penalties, you have to be pretty blatant and not cooperate with them to get at that sort of level. There will be far more businesses suffering penalties in the range of 20 to 40%. The interesting point is that I've seen, and I'm not in the red book, but additional commentary, is that 100% limit potentially is going to be increased to 200% as from 2011. So, we could be seeing considerably higher penalties. And other things that the Inland Revenue are doing, they're getting clever about the use of IT and seeing lots of new sources of data and using those sources of data in order to challenge your tax returns. You may have seen in the press that the fact that they are now getting information from all of the banks, not only about their UK bank accounts but also about offshore accounts, and that has resulted in a lot of tax inquiries with people who had money held offshore that they hadn't reported to the Inland Revenue. But as well as bank data, I've seen cases now where they're looking at land registry data, which was something they never used to look at before. Increasingly they're looking at it going back years and seeing where people have sold properties that wasn't their registered address for tax. Is it a second property that they were letting out? I've seen a case exactly like that. Somebody had sold a property, the revenue picked it up from the disposal on the land registry. It turns out it was a second property they'd been letting out, they hadn't disclosed the income and they hadn't disclosed the capital gain. A great source of more revenue for Customs and Excise. Property letting agents, again, property letting agents are not required to do a return to the Inland Revenue telling them what the income is, but the Inland Revenue have realised that if they launch a tax inquiry into every letting agent in the country, they get access to the books. They can go and see what landlords are getting in terms of income, and then they can go and cross-check that with your tax return and see if you disclose that income. Again, I've had a client referred to me very recently where they've been picked up on exactly that basis. So more and more, the Inland Revenue are getting new sources of data which they are cross-checking with tax returns, and when discrepancies are thrown up, they're using that as a basis for launching an inquiry. Now that brings them up against something which I've referred to on a point there as the inquiry window. With most tax returns, the Inland Revenue have a year in which to make an inquiry. In these circumstances now, they are extending that and saying, we have discovered something about you 2 years ago that you didn't tell us, we want to look into it and charge you the tax now. If you object and say, well, you're outside your inquiry window, they could formally make a discovery assessment, charge you with fraud and pile in, and you're likely to get lots of penalties under a formal investigation. So what they are doing is saying they want to use their informal powers, which they have, to not launch a formal investigation, and the benefit to you is you've been found out, but at least you won't be dragged into the formal penalty regime. If they haven't launched a formal inquiry, you can't be charged within the formal penalty regime. So that is a big incentive to taxpayers to say, yes, okay, I put my hand up, I forgot to put it on my return, I'll pay the tax, I won't make a fuss and all try and claim that you're out of time. So just things to be aware of. All of the penalties are going to be increased substantially, and it was announced in the budget that they're going to start using commercial debt collection agencies to collect tax because they've been criticised quite badly for not collecting half the tax that's due. So they're going to start using commercial debt collection agencies to do it. So expect if you don't pay your POA and VAT on time, you'll get the bailiff arriving on your door rather sooner, or commercial debt collection agency. And of course, if they use commercial debt collection agencies, that information then finds its way into your credit record, your credit history, whereas previously the Inland Revenue never released that debt collection information to credit reference agencies. So it's an area where there's going to be increasing pressure on business to comply with the tax legislation, otherwise face all kinds of issues. I think we're running out of time. I can see Louise here lurking there. So I think that was pretty much what I wanted to say, other than to just repeat a little bit of advertising. Crombies, I'm from Crombies Chartered Accountants, based on Waterloo Road in Wolverhampton. If you have any concerns or problems with tax, please don't worry about them. Come to us. Hopefully we can sort them out for you and you can relax. So it only remains to say, has anybody got any questions? You've all been very, very quiet and asked no questions at all, which either means that I've bored you rigid or it means that everything was perfectly clear and you're quite happy with it. So,
it was the latter.
Sorry?
It was the latter.
It was the latter, it was all clear, right, good, okay. Tax isn't always the most interesting subject. Hopefully I've put it a little bit into into the general picture of seeing where we are in terms of the financial, the economic position, and why the budget has been drafted in the way that it has been. And perhaps when you go away and think about some of the announcements now and from the government, perhaps have a little bit of think about some of the spin that they put on it as well, because as we all know, politicians love spin, and generally we can't trust the thing they say as being truthful. Anyway, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, Ian, can I thank you for a very comprehensive presentation covering some awfully complex material, but in a very easily understandable way. So thank you very much indeed. The time just flew by there. If we weren't concerned at the start, we were scared rigid at the end of it with your new tax penalty schemes coming. So thank you for that as well. Well, we're determined to keep the time, so I appreciate we're all busy people. I hope you've enjoyed that. Personally, I found it incredibly helpful and interesting, I must say. As Ian mentioned, his company, locally based, very keen to offer advice and guidance wherever possible. As I said at the outset, the university and other regional stakeholder partners are also very keen to try and help companies become more competitive with the products and services, etc., etc. So if you require any further support from us, please stay behind and talk to colleagues who'd be very keen to try and help. We're very keen to keep the dialogue going as we move forward. We'll have a number of events being hosted here during the year, so please look out for the announcements, and we'd like to sort of see you at future events as well. So thank you for the time this morning. Hope you enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.